Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, lion, king of the beasts, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Russell Gerber. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here today. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you, Rob. And thanks as always, everyone, for joining us for another wonderful daily dose of nature, of course. And my name, as Rob so kindly put it to you, is, of course, Russell Gerber. And today, talking about one of my favorite animals here in Africa, of course, the lion or African lion, and often referred to, of course, as the king of the beasts. And today we'll go into a bunch of different reasons why I certainly think he or she is the king of the beasts, and a bit of detail into the classification of the animal, its evolution, and of course we'll touch on a few things when it comes to conservation. And as many of you like to ask about, and which we will definitely go into towards the end of our webinar this evening, we'll touch on some areas where you can head to give you the best chance possible to see these wonderful animals in the wild. So welcome, and let's get started. So firstly, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Russell Gerber, as I said, and I am a Natural Habitat Expedition Leader. I've been with Natural Habitat for a few years now, actually since 2018, so it's my 5th year with Natural Habitat, but I have actually been guiding as a safari guide all the way back since 2004. I studied the zoology and African vertebrate biology, and then I went on to do my honors degree in marine biology. And so I've been working in places all over the world in both the safari and marine world, and mostly from a guided experience point of view. So for me, my passion was always the ocean and of course the big African animals, and I've tried my best to make that passion my life, and I've been fortunate enough to do so. I've also, in the last few years, been working as a wildlife presenter at Africam and Explore, which has been a lot of fun. And yeah, for those of you who haven't been out on a trip with me, I hope to see some of you out on a safari with us this year as we dive into the season, or safari season coming up in the next few months. I'm sure some of you will be very keen to get out here and see some of these amazing animals, and of course, hopefully, some lions. So just a bit about background about myself. This was a photo actually taken in the Okavango Delta out on a safari with my lovely wife. And as you can see, it's a pretty fun life to lead with a few drinks on the front of that Land Cruiser, and something you could experience for yourself on a safari with us. So hopefully I'll see you out there. So as I like to do in most of my presentations, is just to go through a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today, as I said. This photograph, by the way, was taken from the Kalahari, also in Botswana. This is a lioness who was sitting in the bright sunshine in the long grass. Actually, this was in the early parts of the year, around actually this time of year, about 4 years ago now, I think, before all the craziness in the world. And as you can see, she was quite enjoying herself in the sunshine as they were moving through to a shady spot. But just quick, let's go through what we'll be talking about today. As I said, some classification of the lion itself. We'll go through some distribution and where you would find lions these days. We'll talk a little bit about life history of the animal to give you more detail about lions that you may not have known before this evening. We'll then go into some detail in the threats facing lions, both from a conservation point of view and even just other animals in the wild that make life as a lion quite difficult. We'll go through some conservation strategies that have been put in place, or that will hopefully be put in place in the future as we move into the positive future that is laid out for lions, and hopefully we can keep it that way. So that will be our outline for this evening, and as I mentioned, I'll also then go into some of the areas which I would recommend for heading out on safari to get your best possible opportunity to see some lions in the wild. So that's really about it in terms of our plan this evening. And of course, some questions at the end if you have anything on your mind or any questions you have about lions or safari in general. And here you can see a picture of some young lion cubs. They were playing around with each other, although this fellow looks super fierce. He was actually a young boy, and they were just playing around with their siblings at the time. So in terms of classification, there is only one species of lion or extant species, Panthera leo. And the subspecies that you find in Asia, of course, which some of you would have heard of, the Asiatic or Indian lion, the classification there is Panthera leo persica. And only one reserve in India that you can still find those animals in the wild. So they really have been decimated in terms of their population all across the globe over the last 100 to 200 years or so. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that as well as we move through our webinar this evening. It belongs to the family Felidae, which of course includes all the cats that we know of, and is, in terms of its evolution, one of the most ancient modern cats, formed around 2 million years ago. Was the first time we started seeing fossil evidence of these lions as we know them today. They share the same genus as tiger, leopard, jaguar, and the snow leopard, of course, and that is, of course, Panthera, and generally make up the biggest cats that we still have around on the planet today, and of course some of the most fearsome predators that we see in the wild across the globe. So a very special animal for Africa, and as the title suggests, often suggested as the king of the jungle or the king of the beasts. That king of the jungle is a little bit of a misnomer, considering lions prefer mainly grassland and savanna areas, but that's neither here nor there. We won't get into too much semantics about that. But here on this diagram, you can see what is a cat family tree. You might have seen this in some of my webinars before as well. I like to use it quite often. The dark blue line you can see from one common ancestor on the left side of your screen, going all the way up to the top, which is the most modern or most recently formed species, is of course the domestic cat, as we know them. Many of you will have some at home, and if you come out on safari, you'll see a lot of similarities between them and of course the big cats out in the wild here in Africa. Lions themselves, if you look at that highlighted red point over there, fall quite low down when it comes to the oldest species, at around about between 2 and 3 million years ago, with jaguar and bobcat being formed, or the first signs of them being formed about 3 million years ago. But as you can see, if you follow that diagram on the left, right down to the bottom, the last little family group there you can see, of course, is Panthera, and that is one of the oldest, or the oldest lineage of cats that we have on the fossil record at this stage. So they've had many, many, many eons to evolve to the amazing animals that we see today. And of course, each one of them in the Panthera group absolutely evolved to become the apex predator of those regions. If you look at the jaguar in South America, leopard here in Africa and India, and a snow leopard, of course, in the Himalaya regions, tigers also in India, and of course lions here in Africa and India. Those are generally your top predators that you will find in each of those regions, each fantastically adapted to that environment and adept at taking down prey, often much larger than themselves. So we'll go into some of that predation technique a little later on as well, but just a quick little outline for you on the evolution of this species and where they came from. So here's a little family of lions taken lying next to the waterhole. This was in the Kruger National Park. Lions themselves, if we go into just a little bit more detail about them as a species, sexually mature at around 2 years old and have cubs pretty much any time of the year. We often see a spike of cubs around this time of year, actually, which is very much our summer. This would be the end of summer for us now, so most of those cubs would have been born already, but it can happen anytime during the year. We just see a little bit of more of a peak of young babies during the early parts of summer, generally around December and January. So sexually mature at 2 years of age, each lioness would have between 1 and 6 cubs after a gestation period of about 110 days or so. They often will then break away, those lionesses, from the pride when they are about to give birth and find themselves a den, generally in as dense cover as they can find, or a little mountain kopje, as we call them, or a small little hillock with some hidden rocky caves, if we could call them that. Anything that can really give her some privacy and security, and she will keep them hidden for the first 6 to 8 weeks, but generally not all in the same place. More often than not, you find that the lions will get disturbed, those lionesses will get disturbed, or other predators might move into the area. So she'll often move the cubs a few times before finally reintroducing them back to the pride. And it is, of course, an extremely vulnerable time for those young cubs. The females then bring those cubs to reintroduce them to the pride or introduce them to the pride at about 8 weeks old, as I mentioned. And often that's a very exciting time for the pride members. And you often see certainly the sub-adult cubs most inquisitive about the newest arrivals. Often dad is really not that interested at all, but certainly the youngsters pay a lot of attention. The wonderful thing about lions, and something that does help them to be successful in their environment, is that any lactating lioness will allow any pride cub to suckle. And so because of that, you often see those lionesses conceiving at the same time. Males will often mate with a number of different females at the same time, and you then have a number of females falling pregnant, breaking away, and then coming back all together, which of course allows those lionesses better opportunity for hunting together, and allows then, of course, the maximum food available for the lionesses to eat. And if they're eating well and hunting well, of course, they are able then to produce as much milk as possible, sharing from any of the lionesses where possible. Now, that's not a rule. I have seen many times where other lionesses will not endure other cubs coming to suckle, but it is common within the lion world that we see that. Females, as I said, can have new cubs just about every 2 years, roughly, in a lifetime of around 15 years, lionesses. Sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter. The males tend to live a little shorter than that, around 12 years old, again, depending on their environment. But as I said, a pretty difficult life for lionesses, and not a particularly long life for the lions in general. And things are pretty tough for them out there. And when it comes to prides, anywhere, most textbooks would tell you they have groups of around 15 or so, but prides can be pretty much anywhere from 4 to even 40 individuals, though these days, something that has been noted by a number of lion conservationists and scientists, and of course just guides in the field, has been the fact that those huge super prides or mega prides that we used to see of around 40 individuals, very, very rare to see these days, with lion prides breaking up more often these days as new males move into areas and then break up that entire pride into basically shattered segments, and often those lionesses moving away from that pride will then go off and start their own prides. So 40 individuals, not common at all these days. Generally, your prides are around 10 or 15 in most areas as we see them. And then I know we have a little bit of a delay on the picture, folks, so hopefully it is coming through. But when you do get to this one, it is just a lovely picture from years ago. This was actually at Mala Mala in the Kruger National Park. And this was a group of lionesses, or sorry, a group of lion cubs that was first being introduced to their father and the rest of the pride for the first time. We were lucky enough to be there on that day where this lioness actually came back to the pride, and this was the first time these little 8-week-old cubs were meeting their family, as it were. And as I said, the sub-adults and the younger members of the pride were far more inquisitive about these 4 young cubs that were joining the pride. This lioness walked straight past the big male, who, I'm not kidding, actually barely even lifted his head as his new progeny arrived on the scene. He couldn't have been less interested, to be honest. So they can be like that. Male lions, they're really there to protect the pride, often get a bit of a bad rep, big male lions, in terms of their role in the pride. But their main role is, of course, protecting the pride and patrolling their territories to keep these young cubs as safe as possible. So lion populations, if they're left alone, can actually grow quite quickly if there's sufficient prey available, if there's water available, and of course mates and territories. So if you have those factors coming together, the populations do actually do quite well. And in many protected game areas, particularly private reserves, lions can eat a lot of prey. So managing those numbers can be tricky as well. If the lions are doing really, really well. The female cubs, in terms of lions, will stay with that pride most of their life, often their entire lives, unless forced out by new males coming into the area to start their own prides. The males, however, are forced to disperse at around 2 years, and dominant males, or they're forced out by the dominant males, excuse me, whereafter they will wander and fend for themselves until old enough to challenge for their own territory. And they will often then form these little coalitions when that happens, simply to give themselves a little more security. Coalition is basically often 2 male lions or 3 male lions of roughly the same age and size who will join up, and often they are related. Sometimes they aren't, they just happen to be the same age, and they will help each other out when they're youngish, and eventually help each other to actually take over a pride. And of course, a coalition of male lions is far more likely to take over a new pride than a single lion taking on a dominant male. So certainly the increased numbers gives them a little bit of an advantage if they're coming into a new area that only has 1 male as the dominant lion. So when those new males do come in and take over a pride, it's often hugely disruptive and stressful for the lions themselves, and as I said, can often cause the breakup of those prides. Territories themselves can range from around 15 square miles to around 400 square miles in certain areas, and that all comes down to the availability of food and water, as we spoke about. So in areas that are far more sparse, perhaps like the Kalahari Desert, you have much larger territories. Areas that have a lot of available feeding and water, those territories are much smaller. Mala Mala itself is a wonderful environment for lions, and the pride's territory sizes in that area in the southern part of Kruger tend, of course, to be much smaller for that reason. So what's happening with our lions? And I wanted to just show you quickly a fairly striking picture that always takes me by surprise every time I see it. This is the current range of lions in orange that you can see there, the African lion, and the light brownish color that you can see there is, of course, the historical range of lions. So the big challenge here, of course, is that you've got a huge decline in the number of lions over the years. It's very difficult to get a credible number at an estimate of the number of lions left, but from all information that has been gathered by conservationists since 1994, the populations have halved across the continent. In areas like West, Central, and East Africa, those areas, the lion numbers have declined by 60%. And in the last 100 years or so, the estimate is a decline from around 200,000 lions to around 20,000 lions still in the wild today. So a huge decline in the numbers that we've seen, and we'll go into the reasons for that in a few minutes, but it is massively concerning, and is a species that is often overlooked because you think of them as so powerful and so dominant that you think that there's really nothing that can impact them. But of course, the major impact they face is human conflicts, and we'll get into more of those conflicts a little later on in our chat this evening. So huge problems facing the lions. As I said, 20,000 that remain to this day, and lots of work that needs to be done in order to protect these wonderful animals. So why are they disappearing? Why are we starting to see less and less of them in certain parts of Africa? And where are they doing well? So this was one of my favorite shots, actually. This was also taken in the Okavango in Botswana, of a lioness hunting in the long grass. You can see she's super wet, walking through some of the marshes there, hunting some red lechwe as she was moving through the grass. So firstly, let's just talk about a little bit about where they are. They're classified as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List, with lions of West Africa considered critically endangered, which, as we spoke about with the decline of around 60 or 70% of lions in West Africa, it is a massive issue for the West African region. Only 6 countries harbor more than 1,000 wild lions, and that's Tanzania, Kenya, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. And in some of those regions, we are actually seeing an increase, which is some good news. The largest subpopulations in reserves in Southern Africa and East Africa, Salunayasa, Ruaharungwa, the Great Limpopo, Okavango, Chobe, Hwangi area, and the Serengeti Mara regions. Now, those are all wonderful safari regions to visit. Again, we'll touch some more on that as we get towards the end of our webinar of wonderful places to visit to give you the best opportunity for seeing lions in the wild. But those are where your largest subpopulations are at the moment. Only Southern Africa has shown a stable or increasing population out of all the remaining regions, which of course is concerning. And being from South Africa and going mainly on safaris in Southern Africa, I have noticed that as well. Our lion viewing generally tends to be excellent in what we see. But having said that, we have noted over the years a definite decline in the pride sizes, a lot of changing of the guard of different prides breaking up because of new males coming into different areas, and the new males coming through could be as a result of the lack of females in other parts of the reserve, or even coming in from outside of the reserve looking for new opportunities. And that, as we've spoken about, can be hugely detrimental to the numbers of lions within a reserve, as those females are put under pressure by the new males coming in. So this one, another one of my favorite shots, also from the Kalahari. These were Kalahari lions. You can see the young male lion on the right-hand side there with his mane just starting to come through, and his lioness sister on the left-hand side of your picture in this particular photograph. And what are the major threats facing these wonderful animals? Now, we're going to go into the more detail on the human impact that they face, but lions, of course, in nature itself face major threats from other species as well. So when there are cubs, as I spoke about, when they are extremely vulnerable, animals like spotted hyena, leopard, wild dogs very occasionally, African rock python, jackals, any predator that may come across those cubs while they are unattended and their mother is off hunting will be extremely vulnerable to predation. And those are absolutely the major threats to lions when they're young. As they get older, the major threats are often from hyenas still. If they are isolated and on their own, they may be outnumbered and may get taken out by hyenas, though that's quite rare. I would say the major threat to them in the wild is actually other lions, as we've spoken about. Other lions coming into the area or territories, so territorial fights for males especially often does lead to the death of one or more males, and that is definitely the major threat that they face in the wild itself. And then other things, of course, drought, where they may struggle to get enough water, though in times of drought it often does give them an advantage in terms of their hunting, and often getting prey is a lot easier for them. As long as it's not too dry, they can actually get some advantage out of that. And of course, disease is a major problem for lions. One of the biggest concerns being tuberculosis, or bovine tuberculosis, that they often pick up from one of their major prey species, buffalo, Cape buffalo, which often carry that tuberculosis. And if it does, is fairly severe in certain individuals, it can actually kill those individuals as well. So those would be the major threats that these lovely animals face in the wild. But when it comes to their major threat, of course, their coexistence with humans is the biggest problem and is extremely difficult to manage as well. It is, of course, a very large and dangerous carnivore. As you can see in this picture, you know, this lioness in the front foreground of your picture, you can see those absolutely rippling muscles. They are voracious predators. A larger pride obviously has to eat a lot, just about every day. And their large size and power, you know, often leads them to protect kills of livestock instead of running away like other species. So when they are protecting that kill from, you know, a shepherd or a farmer whose livestock has now been taken, often lions will stand their ground, which of course can cause problems if they then get shot or taken out by those farmers because of the damage to their livestock. So that is often a big issue as well. Lions are often killed even before they become a problem because of their reputation, which is often a big issue for lions themselves. And human-lion conflict is easily the biggest threat to lion conservation going forward. So that is something that we're going to have to work really hard on, and there are some great little projects that have been put forward for just that reason. Livestock and agriculture, as we mentioned, are going to be the biggest thing that they are going to be targeted for because they take out the livestock and agriculture of a number of people and farmers living adjacent to national parks. The overpopulation of Africa as well and many other areas has led to a concentration of people and farms around these protected areas, which has led to, of course, an increase in encounters and the loss of habitat, persecution. All these things together have made things very difficult for lions when it comes to the conflict between farmers and agriculture on the edge of their territories. Bush meat poaching is something you may have heard of before as well, which is generally animals that are caught in snares laid by poachers, often just looking for something to eat, not targeting species for any major valuable international trade or anything, simply just looking for something to eat. But those traps are indiscriminate, will often catch lions and other predators, even though they were not the target. As I mentioned, the ever-growing populations around wildlife reserves often rely on bushmeat as a cheap protein option. So that, again, another major issue for lions in Africa at the moment. Human encroachment onto previous lion territories. is a major issue. Most lions in Africa, as you would imagine, live in protected areas. With that, you've seen a push from agriculture to move into those protected areas as cattle grazing and grazing land is more and more valuable. So what we see is these cattle moving into wildlife areas, which often degrades the landscape, and that often depletes large ungulate numbers, which is of course a major prey species for lions. And as all that happens, eventually the numbers of the lions actually drop, and because of the lack of other ungulates that are around to hunt, the lions inevitably start hunting cattle, which then puts them in further danger. So what we would then term that as, of course, is lions are considered to be conservation dependent. There's very few lions that live outside of reserves, and if they do, they are in huge danger of being persecuted outside of those reserves. One of the scary numbers in terms of population is that Africa's population itself is expected to increase from 1.2 billion currently to roughly 2.4 billion by 2050. So this is obviously an issue that we really need to grapple with now, as Africa, of course, tries to move into a more developed world and out of poverty. For many of the people living here, it will come as a trade-off, of course, with the protected areas and how we manage those two things side by side. So one that is often spoken about that people bring up a lot when it comes to the depletion of lion numbers, but is actually not as much of a factor as many people think, is of course trophy hunting. Trophy hunting itself is relatively a small factor when you're contributing to the lion's current declining status. The loss of large males, which is generally the target species or target individuals that hunters would go for, does lead to the increased rates of infanticide that we spoke about, with new males coming into those areas after the big dominant male has been taken out. And sometimes that can lower the reproductive and survival rates of other pride members and often pushes lionesses and other pride members into more risky areas or even out of reserves if they feel under enough pressure. So that is certainly an impact that hunting, big game hunting, can have. And another one, of course, is it's subject to widespread abuse of regulations, even though there are strict rules in place. Those rules can be flaunted, and often that can lead to a decline in numbers, but it generally is not one of the major impacts of the declining status of lions. So as we spoke about earlier, the trophy hunting is in conjunction with bushmeat poaching and human lion conflict together. All those things will have an impact on lion numbers themselves, and as I mentioned, the large males are generally the ones that are targeted. Zambia and Zimbabwe, interestingly, actually banned lion hunting, and the lion populations in those areas did grow rapidly. So as I said, it can have an impact, but generally is not the major factor when it comes to the decreasing number of lions that we've seen over the years. And then lastly, lion poaching, targeted lion poaching, is something that has been on the increase in recent years, unfortunately. And the main reason for that is, of course, the trade for medicinal purposes in parts of the eastern world, and different countries using it for different reasons, often, of course, simply for traditional medicine purposes, which, of course, have these particular parts, of course, have no actual medicinal value at all. And unfortunately, they're targeted for those body parts that get sold, as I said, in traditional medicine markets around the world. And because of the increased value of these parts, we're seeing increasingly sophisticated means utilized to circumvent anti-poaching efforts, which are extensive when you go to the private reserves and even other parts of Southern Africa where you have the Defence Force protecting these wild areas. So all these factors together should show you that lions are under a lot of pressure, but there are a huge number of people out there working very hard to make sure that lions make it into the future as we move forward in African conservation. So many of you will be asking, okay, well, that's pretty sad and pretty tough to hear, but where do we go to from here? Well, as I mentioned, we have seen in certain parts and areas where the reserves and lions are well protected, that we do see an increase in lion numbers in those areas. And increasing the size of those protected areas and strengthening the protection of those protected areas will absolutely have positive impacts on the number of lions in Africa. And many regions, that is the main focus of improving those lion numbers. And there is constant new land and property being bought up by ecotourism investors and of course government working hand in hand with them to increase these protected areas as tourism becomes a more valuable commodity to a huge number of African countries, where before the focus on primary resources like mining and of course agriculture, we're starting to see a shift towards tourism in many aspects. Another thing that needs to be looked at, of course, is the reduction of human and wildlife conflict, and there are a number of really cool projects out there to help mitigate that, from large Anatolian shepherds, a type of dog that is trained to keep big cats away from their livestock, to the Big Cat Lights program that's been running in East Africa, which I'll get to in just a little while as well. Looking at the trophy hunting, reforming the trophy hunting practice and making sure that it is as regulated as possible. Although in my opinion, I would prefer it to be gone entirely if I had a choice. But if not, certainly making sure that those practices are above board. And then one of the most difficult challenges is reducing the demand for lion parts in various traditional medicine markets, which is a very difficult thing to do. And I'm not sure how we achieve that except for education in those regions and the emphasis on those body parts having no real medicinal value. So as I mentioned, for me, the biggest key to the protection of all of these animals is tourism. And I've always felt quite strongly about the impact of ecotourism or conservation tourism as a means for protecting animals here in Africa and around the world, and without question, the lion itself. From a travel point of view, of course, coming with us and with me out on a safari here in Africa is one of the best ways you can learn more about the conservation of these species and lions in particular, and of course contribute to the ongoing protection of them. The value of tourism to these regions is almost immeasurable. You know, over the last few years, with a massive decrease in numbers of tourists coming out to Africa and to these wild places, we saw a gradual increase in the number of poaching incidents, bushmeat, trapping, etc., as the communities around these reserves were becoming more and more desperate. The amount of money brought into those communities by keeping lions alive is massive, and certainly far more valuable than trophy hunting when it comes to the lifespan of a single lion. Of course, taking a picture of a lion 500,000 times rather than shooting one lion once, it has a lot more value over its lifespan. So honestly, tourism and ecotourism is the key to increasing these wildlife areas and protected areas here in Africa and keeping them as wild as possible as Africa moves into a development phase across the continent. And hopefully we can keep them living side by side. Some trips that I would recommend you join if you are interested in seeing some lions out in the wild is secluded South Africa, right down here in South Africa. Botswana Explorer, which is another one that I host in Botswana, where we go into more wild regions, particularly around the Kalahari and the Okavango Delta. And then Ultimate East Africa, of course, which takes us into wonderful areas of the Serengeti, Masai Mara, and the Ngorongoro Crater, all absolutely fantastic places to see lions in the wild. And of course, even the opportunity of seeing lions hunting, which is not for everyone, I have to tell you. It's not always easy to see a big cat taking down a prey species or a large ungulate or anything like that. But it is very exciting when it does actually happen. The lions are not particularly well known for huge or high success rates in hunting, with only around a 30% success rate in hunting on each hunt that they do. I mentioned some of the projects that have been looked at. Lion relocation programs is also another good one in terms of moving around lions into different private reserves. This helps to, of course, increase the gene pool and the strength of the gene pool as these private reserves population of their lions grow. And private reserves, generally not as big as places like Kruger or the Okavango, but they play an important role in moving these lions around to different areas and reintroducing new genes into different regions through the various relocation programs between the reserves. And it's a great project itself. And then with WWF, there is the wonderful Lion Lights project that is underway in East Africa. You can check that out at the link below. I know you can't see it too well there. But if you go check it out at www.kenya.org, you'll be able to find that lion project, which is a really interesting project of flashing lights, solar flashing lights around livestock enclosures at night, which actually manages to be very successful in keeping lions away from those areas at night, and so far have shown real positive results in reducing that conflict between the cattle farmers on the edge of the reserves. And hopefully more projects like that can be looked at as we move into the future. And I think that's about it from me. I hope that I covered everything. But of course, if I didn't, if you have any questions or anything on your mind, please fire away.
All right, thank you, Russell. Before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So if a new male takes over a pride, do they kill the male lion who was previously overseeing the pride, and do they kill the young cubs as well?
So in terms of the male, the previously dominant male, they may kill him. He might be injured badly enough that he will die. Often they do kill him, but more often than not, he runs away, sometimes badly injured, but he will run away and often live out the rest of his days on his own, scavenging a lot and trying to eke out an existence. Sometimes they will be successful enough on their own while they're away to build up their strength and even take over another pride. It does happen from time to time, not very common, but it does happen every now and again. In terms of the cubs, unless the lioness can actually run away completely from that territory and keep her cubs with her, it's very likely that the male will kill all of her cubs. And the purpose for that is to bring her into estrus as quick as possible, to give that new male lion or new male lions the opportunity to mate with her as soon as possible to continue their genes, of course, into the next generation. So it's a pretty brutal world for lions, but that is the reality.
Are there males who go their whole lives without ever forming their own pride?
There are some, yeah, it depends on where they are and what's available. Sometimes they simply won't be able to take on the males in that area. Most often, though, they will keep moving until they find something. If they stay healthy enough, and if they get enough food to reach adulthood, that young bit of enthusiasm and strength and young muscles and power often will be enough to take over a a pride at some point, perhaps from not such a strong or dominant male. But one way they get around that is those coalitions that we spoke about. So, a weaker male lion may form a coalition with 2 or 3 or 4 other male lions, and then with those 3, be able to take over a pride. And he will still get to mate with the females, but not as often as the more dominant ones, who will be more likely to get their genes into the next generation. But that tends to be the cycle of lions. And yeah, sometimes they won't ever get their own pride, but more often than not, they will actually be able to take one for themselves.
So, do you know if there are more male or female cubs typically born?
No, it's about 50-50. That tends to be, if you look at it from a generational point of view, similarly to people, around 50%, maybe about 51% female, but I would say mostly you see it's pretty much straight down the middle, 50-50.
So one of our guests is asking if it's true that a lioness will mate with several pride males when she's an estrus, so they won't know which is the father of the resultant cubs. Is that so?
Exactly right. Yeah. So that is one of the hypotheses put forward, is that's why she does it, to get them all to be as appeased as possible. It's not always the case. Sometimes she will just mate with the most dominant male, and because he's the most dominant male, if any of the others even attempted to go for the cubs, he would scare them off. So it depends on the group, but yes, I have seen that many times where the female will mate with a number of males during her estrus cycle, or even over a few estrus cycles, and will actually give this false impression that she is, keen to have that particular male lion's babies. So it does happen, and yeah, it is quite common.
Would a lioness with cubs leave the pride before the conflict between the dominant male and the challenging male happens in an effort to keep them safe, or will they always stay with the pride?
So mostly they will stick around until they know the outcome, and the lionesses will even help that male if they feel like the current male that they have has the possibility of winning that fight, which often they do. The lionesses will actually help out to chase these new males away. They would prefer not to have the change. They don't want the disruption. They would prefer to keep the male that they have, or males that they have, so that their cubs can grow up in the most stable environment possible. So often you'll see the females helping out the dominant male in that case. If they see that things are turning south, and it often happens pretty quickly, the problem is generally then it's too late for them to escape with the cubs. But if they can, and the new males do take over, they will try to get away as quick as they can, if possible. The big challenge for them is moving into another territory of other lionesses that they don't know. And those lionesses do not take kindly to new lionesses coming into their territory, and will often then be killed by those lionesses. So it's really difficult, and they would try as best they can to keep the territory and male that they already have as long as they can.
How often does the female leave the young cubs to hunt before she rejoins the pride?
So when they're quite young, it will be not too often. She will stay with them most of the day. But as they start feeding more and more, and she is of course required to produce more and more milk, she will leave just about every day for a period. And during that time, she will be, of course, hunting on her own. She will sometimes just take down small little antelope that she can find, even a rabbit or anything that she gets the opportunity to keep her energy up, and then will constantly go back to the cubs to let them suckle, and then go back out on the hunt again. So it's really tough for her. You know, at the peak of it, she will be hunting pretty much every day. And again, depending on how big a meal she can get. Also, because she's on her own, if she gets something really big, she'll have to eat as fast as she can because she's not able to protect that kill from other predators as well as she would if she had the pride with her. So all those factors make it very difficult for lionesses to get their cubs to even just to the 8 weeks where they reintroduce them to the pride. So really, really tricky for them. And as I said, at its peak, she'll be hunting every day to provide enough milk for those babies.
Does the South African government try to stop the encroachment of population on conservation areas?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are, of course, national parks, and so they're doing their best to do that. It's not always the encroachment that's the issue. It is just the increased number of people along the edge of the reserve. Now, even though they're fences, these are big animals, and often there are holes in the fences that form. Holes that get dug by other animals like warthogs that often dig holes under the fences, and then lions can get through them. And those are the issues that we see with the conflict on the edges of the reserves. There are places where there is encroachment, illegal encroachment, and government or private enterprise, if it is private reserves, will then try and move those people out, but which is also always a very difficult socio-economic issue as well, because people are looking for more grazing land, as parts of Africa, of course, are prone to drought, and they're forced to move into areas where their cattle can actually get some grazing. All these factors together make it difficult for government. And one of the programs, that is most common is, of course, the compensation of those people. If they do lose cattle to a lion on the edge of these reserves, that they are compensated for it in a timely manner as well, which is important. So yeah, they certainly do try to keep these areas as protected as possible, but it's always an ongoing conversation with the communities around the reserves.
Can you talk about what some of the countries that depend heavily on tourism are doing to conserve their lion populations to stop the decline?
So a number of things that we spoke about already, but for me, the biggest factor is, from our major safari destinations in sub-Saharan Africa, let's say. So if you look at Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, to name a few, but those would be the major regions that you would see where government and private enterprise has worked really, really hard to create large protected areas. And the success of those protected areas has gone hand in hand with the engagement of the communities around those areas. So those communities not only getting the jobs and opportunity of working in lodges adjacent to their communities in these private reserves or in the national parks, but also the actual ownership of part of these reserves for the communities, where the money is pooled into those communities and then shared amongst them. So they're getting real measurable return from those conservation areas, and it starts to get people not necessarily moving away from agriculture, but certainly understanding the value of protecting these big animals that often cause problems for them in their life. If they're seeing real value for protecting a lion, if they know they're going to get compensated if one of their cattle is taken, or if they are, they know they're going to receive a certain lump sum of money each year from the conservation area that they live adjacent to. Those factors have, without question, led to the success of certain lion populations in Southern Africa. And I think that is the key in moving forward and engaging with those communities consistently and continuously, because there'll always be new challenges to be faced. But if they could see the real value of protecting these animals, which is also, of course, their own legacy. These people all over Africa have been living alongside lions for millennia, and so it can be done. It's obviously just a matter of will and a matter of government actually pushing these agendas forward and making sure that those communities are getting benefit from these protected areas.
Well, thank you. That's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for those great questions. It's a really tricky thing, lion conservation, and for any major predator in any part of the world, it's always going to have this reputation of being something that is extremely dangerous and needs to be wiped out. But hopefully this evening I showed you that that's not the case. They are extremely important to all these environments, and it really is something that can be protected as we go forward into the conservation of lions over the next few decades, and we'll see where it goes. But hopefully I'll see you out on a safari, which is honestly the best way you can protect these lovely animals, and I hope to see you on one of those trips later this year. But for now, it's a good night from me, and I'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.